The Duke of Ellingsworth had been sitting on the steps of the market cross at Barrowfield for 2 hours in a dead man's coat, and in that time 41 people had walked past him, and not one of them had looked at his face. The 42nd was the woman he was going to marry. He knew her from the miniature, which had been sent to him in a case lined with blue velvet, along with a letter from her aunt describing her as amiable. She was coming up from the poultry stalls with a basket on her arm and a mended straw bonnet and a list in her hand, and she was doing sums under her breath as she walked, which the miniature had not mentioned. Simeon looked down at the flagstones, because that was the part of the disguise that mattered. The coat was a bricklayer's, bought off a widow in Cowden for 4 shillings. The boots were his own gamekeeper's. There was brick dust and kiln ash worked well into his hands and under his nails, and he had not shaved in 6 days. None of it would have signified in the least if he had gone on looking people in the eye. Her shoes stopped in front of him. "Have you eaten today?" Simeon had rehearsed a great many answers in 2 hours. He found he had none. "No," he said. She set the basket down on the step. She took out a small worn purse and opened it, and he watched her turn it over and shake it into her palm, and what came out was 1 sixpence. He knew by then precisely what a 6pence was in that town. It was a quartern loaf and a bit over. It was the carrier's fare from Barrowfield to Wexley, 4 miles on a wet road. She put it into his hand and closed his fingers over it with both of hers, the way one does with something that might blow away. "That is the whole of it," she said. "So please do not let anyone take it off you." "What is your name?" "Sim," said Simeon from somewhere far away. "Mine is Melisande Hart." She was already picking up the basket. "Sim, there is hiring at the lime kiln at Cowden on a Monday, if you can walk it. Ask for a man called Bassett and tell him you can read if you can. It is the reading they want and nobody thinks to say so." And then she was gone up the street, and Simeon of Ellingsworth sat on a cold step with 6pence in his fist, and understood that he had come 4 days' journey to test a woman's character, and had instead had his own weighed out and found wanting in under a minute. He had meant it as a piece of sense, not of cruelty. That was what he told himself, and he had told it to himself with great conviction all the way from Ellingsworth. The arrangement had been made by letter, as such things are, between his uncle and her aunt. A clergyman's daughter of good family and no money, 24 years old, and a duke of 38 who required a wife, and had no intention of standing in a ballroom being appraised like a hunter at a fair. The wedding was set for the 11th of next month. They had never met. And Simeon had wanted once, before he bound a stranger to himself for life, to see what she was when nobody was looking. He had a reason. It was 15 years old and he had never spoken it aloud to any living creature. At 23 he had been a second son with 300 a year, and he had loved a girl in Somerset with his whole ridiculous heart, and had asked her, and been refused with great kindness and no hesitation at all. 2 years later his brother went through the ice at Ellingsworth and Simeon came into the title, and within 4 months that same young woman had contrived to be seated beside him at a dinner in town, and had laughed at everything he said, and had spoken with perfect tenderness of the understanding that once been between them, which had never existed. He had not been angry. That was the trouble. He had simply understood, at 25, that his face meant one thing in a good coat and another in a poor one, and after that he had never in 15 years been able to accept a single kindness without turning it or to look for the price stamped on the back. So he had put on a dead man's coat and gone to sit on a step. He came back the next day, telling himself he wanted more evidence. She had a loaf and a piece of hard cheese in her basket, and she gave him half of both, and sat down on the step beside him to eat her share, which was the thing that finished him. Not the bread, the sitting down. In a market square, on a Wednesday, in front of the whole of Barrowfield, a clergyman's daughter put her skirts aside and sat on a cold step next to an unshaven man in a bricklayer's coat, and asked him how the walk to Cowden had gone. "They are not hiring till Monday." "Then Monday it is." She broke the cheese. "Your hands are burnt. There was a kiln went up at Markford in the spring." "I am sorry," said Melisande Hart, and meant it, and did not ask him anything else about it, which he found was a courtesy he had not been shown in 15 years by anybody with a title. On the 3rd day it rained, and she found him under the arch, and they talked for the better part of an hour. And she told him, because he asked, and because there is nobody on earth so safe to tell a thing to as a man on a step who will be gone by Monday, that she was to be married on the 11th of next month, to a duke, she said. You will not believe it. I do not believe it. Simeon looked at the rain coming off the arch. You'll be glad of that. I am terrified of it. She turned the wet edge of her shawl over in her fingers. I have never met him. My aunt has a miniature of him that makes him look like a man carved out of a mantelpiece. Everybody who writes to us says the same thing in a different way, that he is cold, that he is exact, that he is not to be trifled with. Nobody has yet troubled to tell me one single thing that he likes. Perhaps there is nothing to tell. There is always something to tell, she said. Nobody is born like that. Somebody is made like that, usually by being handled a great deal and looked at very little. She stood up and shook out her skirts. I have decided that I shall be kind to him anyway. I dare say nobody has been for a long while and have nothing else to bring him, so it may as well be that. Then she said goodbye and told him again about Basset at the lime kiln, and went out into the rain and up the road towards Wexley. Simeon stood under the arch for a long time. On the third morning he had followed her, at a distance, out of an instinct he did not examine, and had watched her walk the whole 4 miles home in the wet with the basket on her arm, because on the Tuesday she had given her carrier's fare to a man on a step. The betrothal dinner at Ellingsworth was on Thursday week. He had 8 days to write to her and confess it, and he used every one of them badly. He got as far as 5 drafts. Each of them, read over, was a duke explaining himself, and every explanation made the thing worse, because there was no arrangement of English in which sitting on a step to be given a woman's last sixpence came out as anything but what it was. So he was shaved and dressed and standing under the chandelier in the long drawing-room at Ellingsworth on Thursday, when the doors opened and Miss Melisande Hart was announced. She came in on her aunt's arm in a made-over silk of a colour that had been fashionable 11 years before. She curtsied to the room. She got as far as the middle of the carpet, and then she looked up at him properly, and Simeon watched the whole thing cross her face. The pause, the small frown, the recognition, and then a stillness so complete that it frightened him more than a scream would have. She did not scream. She did not falter. She gave him her hand and said that she was very happy to make his Grace's acquaintance, and went in to dinner on his arm and talked for 2 hours to a bishop's wife about the price of coals. He found her afterwards in the long gallery, alone by the 3rd window. Miss Hart, she said, without turning round, bricklayer, out of Markford. 6 shillings a week when there was a kiln to work in, yes. How long did you sit there? 2 hours on the Tuesday. About the same on the Wednesday and the Thursday. She turned. Her eyes were dry and very bright, and her voice, when it came, was perfectly level, which he learned that night was how she was angry. You did not test my character, your Grace, she said. You tested my ignorance. Those are not the same thing, and I will not have them confused. If you had come to Barrowfield as yourself and asked me plainly what I was, I should have told you, and you would have had to decide whether to believe me, and that would have cost you something. She drew a breath. Instead you sat on a step, and let me hand you the last of my money, and every kindness I did you, you were pricing. 3 days I fed a man and told him things I have not told my own aunt, and the whole while I was on trial and did not know the court was sitting. Simeon stood and took it. There was nothing in it that was not true. You are right, he said. I will not argue any part of it, and I will not say I did it for your good, because I did it for mine. He put his hands behind him. I will tell you why, if you will hear it, and then I will tell you what I mean to do about it, and the second part does not depend upon the first. She listened to the whole of it, the 300 a year, the girl in Somerset, the ice, and the dinner in town 4 months after, and the 15 years of turning every kindness over to look for the price on the back. When he had finished, she said nothing for a long moment. That is a reason, she said. It is not an excuse. No. What is the second part? The engagement is at an end whenever you say the word, and the word may be said tonight or in 10 years. Your settlement stands either way. It is signed and it is yours, and no lawyer of mine will ever be permitted to touch it. If you go, the fault will be published as mine, in my own hand, over my own name, in whatever terms you dictate. He found his voice was not quite steady and let it be unsteady. You will not be a woman a duke thought better of. I would burn Ellingsworth first. Melisande Hart looked out of the window at the dark park for a long while. I do not want to go, she said at last. I want something harder than that. On Tuesday I am taking 3 baskets to the almshouse at Barrowfield, because I have done it every Tuesday for 6 years. You will come with me. You will wear that same coat, and you will carry the baskets, and you will not be a duke for one entire day, and nobody there will be told. She looked round at him. You have seen what I am when I do not know I am being watched. It seems only just that I should see the same. He carried the baskets. It was 11 miles there and back, and it rained for the last 4. There were 9 women in the almshouse at Barrowfield, and none of them thought him anything but a labouring man in a bad coat. They set him to mending a shutter and then to bringing coal. And one of them told him his hands were burnt and that he wanted a poultice, and Simeon of Ellingsworth, who had sat in the Lords, sat on a settle in a lime-washed room and let an old woman put a poultice on his hands and tell him about her husband, dead 19 years. Old Wick was there, the man who had been begging beside him at the market cross, and did not know him either, and shared his fire. Coming home in the dusk, with the baskets empty and his coat soaked through, Simeon said, "It has been a Tuesday every week for 6 years. Yes. And when we are married the whole county will call it charity, and put it in the newspapers, and give you a great deal of credit for it." "Yes," said Melisande. "That will be the worst of it. It was mine while it was worth nothing." They walked on away in the wet. "I was not only angry," she said abruptly. "On Thursday I ought to say so, because you have said your worst thing, and it is not fair that I should keep mine." She kept her eyes on the road. "For 3 days I liked a man on a step better than I expected ever to like the man I was to marry. I had made my peace with a mantelpiece, and then I sat on a cold stone in front of the whole of Barrowfield, and was happier than I had been in a year, and I walked home 4 miles thinking what a pity it was. And then you turned out to be him, and I did not know where in the world to put the feeling, and so I put it down as fury, because fury one can carry." Simeon stopped in the middle of the road. "Melisande, do not," she said, "say anything clever." "I have nothing clever." The rain was running off the brim of the borrowed hat. "You said nobody had troubled to tell you one thing that I like. I like a woman who does sums under her breath in a market square. I like being sat down beside. I have been handled a great deal and looked at very little, exactly as you said, and in 3 days you looked at me twice, and it has ruined me for every other kind of attention there is." She reached up and took the wet hat off his head so that she could see his face, and neither of them said anything else at all for some while, and the rain came down on the Barrowfield road and did not trouble either of them in the least. They were married on the 11th, and she wore the made-over silk because she said it had done nothing to deserve being retired. The almshouse at Barrowfield was rebuilt within 3 years, 18 rooms and a physician's fee endowed for ever. And at the opening the Duke of Ellingsworth was required to say a few words and said, instead, only this, that every stone of it had been bought with a 6pence, and that he had the 6pence still, and would show it to anybody who wished to see. It hung on his watch chain, drilled through and worn thin at the edges, for the rest of his life. He never once had to explain it at home. His wife knew exactly what it had cost, having counted it out of her purse in the market square on a Tuesday, for a man in a dead man's coat whose face nobody else had looked at all day.